Shri Krishna Parabrahmane Namaha. Now I would like to discuss about peace as a social contract. This is a topic. Before that, let us start with the prayer. Ramaya Ramabhadraya Ramachandraya Vedhase Raghunathaya Nathaya Sitaya Pataye Namaha. Peace as a social contract. How? My perspective and associated meaning of peace are best summarized through a number of social principles. These have been documented and evidence given for them elsewhere, as will be noted for each. Let us see the conflict principle. Conflict is a balancing of powers among interests, capabilities, and wills. It is a mutual adjusting of what people want, can get, and are willing to pursue. Conflict behavior, whether hostile actions, violence, or war, is then a means and manifestation of this process. The cooperation principle. Cooperation principle depends on expectations aligned with the power. Through conflict in a specific situation, a balance of powers and associated agreement are achieved. This balance is a definite equilibrium among the parties' interests, capabilities, and wills. The agreement is a simultaneous solution to the different equations of power and thereby the achievement of a certain harmony, structure of expectations. At the core of this structure is a status quo or particular expectations over rights and obligations. Conflict thus interfaces and interlocks a specific balance of powers and as associated structure of expectations. Cooperation, contractual or familistic interactions depends on a harmony of expectations. A mutual ability of the partial to predict the outcome of their behavior. Such is, for example, the major value of written contract or treaty. And this structure of expectations depends on a particular balance of powers. Thus, cooperation depends on expectations aligned with power. The gap principle. A gap between expectations and power causes conflict. A structure of expectations, once established, has considerable social inertia, while the supporting balance of powers can change rapidly. Interests can shift, new capabilities can develop, will can strengthen or weaken. As the underlying balance of powers changes, a gap between power and the structure of expectations, once established, has considerable social inertia, while the supporting balance of powers can change rapidly. Interests can shift, new capabilities can develop, wills can strengthen or weaken as the underlying balance of powers changes. A gap between power and the structure of expectations can form, causing the associated agreement to lose support. The larger this gap, the greater the tension toward revising expectations in line with the change in power, and thus the more likely some random event will trigger conflict over the associated interests. Such a conflict then serves to create a new congruence between expectations and power. Conflict and cooperation, therefore, are interdependent. They are alternative phases in a continuous social process underlying human interactions. Now, conflict, then cooperation, and then again conflict. Cooperation involves a harmony of expectations, congruent with a balance of powers achieved by conflict. Now, let us see the nature of social contract. Social contracts, the structural basis of peace as here defined, take many forms that interconnect and overlap in diverse, complex ways to order social communities and organizations. Expectations between the following discussions. 3 points should be kept in mind. First, as mentioned, a social contract is the outcome of the parties balancing their mutual interests, capabilities, and wills, and is based on a particular balance, thus achieved a balance of powers. Second, the powers constituting the balance are not necessarily coercive or authoritative. Threat or legitimacy are not the only basis for social contracts. Altruistic, intellectual, or exchange powers may dominate. Thus, a social contract may become or may be a marriage agreement, an understanding developed among scientists over a disputed theory or a sale in a market. Third, a social contract. This piece is only a phase in a conflict's helix and is thus a temporary equilibrium in the long term movement of interpersonal, social, or international relations. Now, expectations. As used here, an expectation is a prediction about the outcome of one's own behavior. A social contract harmonious certain expectations between the parties. That is, it enables each to reliably predict the other's responses. Such expectations are varied. Our vocabulary for discriminating among them is well developed. Remembering my fundamental concern with social peace and conflict, these can be divided into status quo and non-status quo expectations. The concept of status quo is basic to their volumes. The reason for this necessity is that status quo expectations define the basic rights and obligations of the parties involved and therefore affect vital values. These rights and obligations form the two types of status quo expectations: responsibilities, duties, and so on. Note especially that expectations about property, who owns what, are part of the status quo. Obviously, the division between status quo and non-status quo expectations is not clear cut. The Criterion of discrimination is salience of fundamental values and thus intensity of feeling and commitment. For example, agreements and property will usually involve strong emotions and commitment, while agreed upon rules or practices, advantages or benefits are less vital and violations more tolerable. However, we are dealing here with a great complexity of social contracts and the subjectivity of underlying interests, meanings, and values. In some situations, a rule, payment, or service may be a life or death matter or a question of fundamental principle to the parties involved, and thus, for this case, a matter of the status quo. Therefore, this classification occurs. Generality. A second type of theoretical dimension delineates a social contract's generality. One such dimension concerns whether a contract is unique or common. A unique social contract is a one-time only agreement within a unique situation and concerning non-repetitive events or interaction between the parties. Such is the implicit agreement wrought in an alley by a thug whose knife coerces you to hand over your money. Another example is a 2-hour ceasefire agreement to enable combatants to clear the battlefield of wounded, or a neutral state granting American relief plans a once only flyover to rush food and medicine to earthquake victims in a neighboring state. By contract, a common social contract involves repeated events or patterns of interaction. Treaties, legal contracts, constitutions, and charters are usually of this type. Clearly, the unique common dimension is a continuum, since between the unique 2-minute hold up and the common overriding political constitution of a state are a variety of social contracts combining in a different ways unique and common expectations. Turning to the second generality dimension, social contracts may be bilateral, involving only two parties, multilateral in covering more than two parties, or collective. The latter covers a society, community, or a group. Constitutions or charters are this type, as are an organization bylaws. While this may seem clear enough, there is an organization bylaws. While this may seem clear enough, there is an intellectual trap to avoid here, that of always viewing collective social contracts necessarily constructed, designed, or the explicit and conscious outcome of a rational process of negotiation. Collective contracts also may emerge from the interwoven multi-layered bilateral and multilateral social contracts, the crisis crossing a society. The integrated system of abstract rules, norms, mores, and customs spanning a society for man indirect collective social contract. It is implicit and informal. Its expectations are partly conscious, partly unconscious. The system of informal rules of the road is such a collective agreement governing, along with coextensive formal traffic laws, a community of drivers. While no group of people may have formally or consciously agreed to a collective social contract, while such may emerge from various lower level social contracts, many of which are conscious agreement, it is still based on a particular balance of powers now involving all members of the collective. Consider, for example, the historically rapid dissolution and restructuring of collective expectations involving rules, customs, and laws that have occurred as a result of conquest, of military defeat and occupation or revolution. Of course, not all norms, customs, or customary laws are changed. No more than a new bilateral or multilateral contract will discard all previous expectations. New social contracts build on the old. However, a new social contract, collective or otherwise, will be meaningfully different. Associated interaction between the parties will change significantly. Finally, the third dimension defining a contract's generality may be narrow, middle range, or overarching. A narrow contract concerns only a few interests, events, or behaviors, such as a contract to point a car, a trade treaty increasing the quote on imported sugar, or the price of Sony television set, etc. An overarching contract develops from, refers to, or spans a whole system of relationships such as those of a family, the larger society, or an organization. A marriage contract stipulating duties and rights of spouses, an organization's constitution, or the system of norms covering a society are some examples. Between the narrow and characteristic of a variety of middle range socially contracts covering or involving or a manifest a large amount of behavior but not the whole. Society once work contract, an alliance between states and the peace treaty are examples in the middle range. Theoretical dimensions. Actually or actuality, theoretical dimensions along which social contracts vary and have organized them into four general types. To begin with, social contracts may to be informed as are unwritten or understandings between friends or allies, or they may be a formal as with the treaties. They may be implicit, tacit agreements that the parties choose not to mention as a wife's conception of her husband's affairs, or they may be explicit, such as a verbal conflict or contract. They may be subconscious, as whom and co-workers consequently unconsciously avoid sensitive topics over which they might fight, or, of course, the social contract may be conscious. These three dimensions, informal versus formal, implicit versus explicit, and subconscious versus conscious, concerns the actuality of social contracts, whether they are a talent agreement underlying the social behavior or a manifest compact of some kind. A fourth, quote, quite important dimension defining how a social contract is manifested. A direct social contract is a specific agreement between particular parties. It gives or implies names, doctors, places, and defined expectations. Contracts are usually thought of as this kind, such as a construction contract between two firms or a trade treaty among three states. However, treaty or direct contracting or may overlap or be interconnected through the different parties and thus form a system of contracts. And these systems themselves may be interconnected or general expectations such as abstract rules, norms as privileged at the level of the social system. And it writes, no one will have agreed to these expectations, nor are they connected with too many particular interests, but they are worthless, comprise a social contract covering the social system. A contract may be positive or negative in the same sense as good or bad. There is a potential confusion in the use of these terms, however, since here a social contract equals peace. Positive peace has come to mean, especially among Scandinavian ionologists, an existing or ideal social state, such as the achievement of individual potential, as reflected in social equality, for example. Negative peace is simply the absence of violence. This, however, is a confusion of categories and leads to such a strange, not consistent expressions as a positive negative peace. Simply, we mean positive as good and negative as bad in qualifying social contracts or peace. A second evaluative dimension defines one kind of good social contract, whether it is just or unjust. It is this dimension of social contracts that is a major focus of this book. Understanding that a social contract defines a particular peace. My question is, what is just peace? My answer developed in part 2 is that justice is the freedom of people to form their own communities or to live undesirable ones. For a large scale societies, just peace is prompted through a minimum government. Now, social orders. A social order is a particular arrangement of direct and indirect social contract forming a meaningful, causal, functional whole. Two types of social orders are of concern here. One is that of groups, the other of societies. These different groups define different structures of peace and capabilities of our powers. Societies. The three pure types listed have been discussed at length in and their empirical validity was assessed there. A society is defined by division of labor and accordingly certain shared meanings, values, and norms, social interactions, and communication system. It is shaped by an indirect overarching collective structure of expectations, a mainly informal and implicit social contract. The form of social power primarily underlying this contract determines the types of society. An exchange society is dominated by exchange power, and authoritative society by authoritative power. A coercive society by coercion, by virtue of dominating form of power and associated social dynamics. Each society manifests a particular dimension of conflict, with exchange societies least violent, coercive the most. Each type of society is thus a different kind of peaceful order. International relations among societies are of special importance here. Nation states form an exchange society with a liberating government, pluralistic conflict, and associated pluralistic structure of peace. In later discussing international peace, we can make use of this social fact. Let us see the summary. It can be shown the diversity of social contracts and the peace through detailing their various expectations, dimensions, forms, and orders. We need only underline now the nested, overlapping, and hierarchical complex of such contracts, filling out the structure of a group or society. Consider, for example, a voluntary organization such as university. It has an overarching contract defining its purposes, organizational structure, positions, and attendant, rights and obligations, and associated rules and law norms. Under the cover of these expectations are defined related social contracts and system of contracts governing separate systems, administrative functions, colleges, divisions, and departments. Within the constraints of universities' overarching expectations, each contract Our system has a certain life depending on the administrators, deans, and faculty and student rank, and defining the role of students and rules of judging issues before the department. And should be clear, each department, college, and administrative divisions on will be on an arena of conflict, establishing or reviving such expectations. Although the overarching social contract that constitutes the university remains stable, a region of social peace at its level. The university itself is within an overarching social contract that is a larger society. PC is therefore complex, multi layered. To present a theory about a just peace demands clarity about the associated expectations, dimensions, and social orders. श्रीकांताय कल्याण निधे निधेन्द्राम श्री वेंकटनिवासाय श्रीनिवासाय मंगलम मंगला शास्त्रपरिमदाचार्य पुरोगमयि सर्वैश्च पूर्वैराचार्य सत्कृतायास्तु मंगलम्.